In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. A few years ago now, when I was serving at St. David's Church in Aurelia, our church got involved for the first time in the Advent conspiracy. Now, some of you know what the Advent conspiracy is. It is a different way of thinking about Christmas gifts. So instead of giving gifts of stuff to people who probably don't need more stuff, instead we encourage people to give the gift of water to somebody in our world, a community in our world that doesn't have access to clean water. So that first year that we were involved in the Advent conspiracy, our goal was to raise $1,750 so that we could build a well through our relief agency. We could build a well in a community in Africa or South America where they didn't have access to water. But there were a few people in my congregation who said to me, "That's great, but what are we doing about the many Canadians who don't have access to clean water, particularly in our First Nations communities?" Now, I was friends with Val Kerr, and so I knew that many of our First Nations communities don't have that basic infrastructure that we take for granted and didn't necessarily have clean water. I was aware of that. Now, for those of you who are newer to St. George's, Val Kerr was one of our priests here at St. George's up until last year. Val is a First Nations woman, and she has been a major advocate and educator in the church and in the community around First Nations issues. So I was aware about the need for water, drinking water, toilets in many of our Indigenous communities, but I had no idea what could be done about that. Now, you might call this a coincidence, or you might call it a God incidence. But as I was beginning to wonder about that, and the people of St. David's were beginning to wonder about that, it turns out that all across Canada in Anglican churches, people were also beginning to wonder, what can we be doing about water in First Nations communities? And that movement of the Spirit led to the creation of a group under the leadership of our national Indigenous Bishop, Mark MacDonald. And it took a lot of patience and it took a lot of inquiry and hard work, but eventually that group was able to form a partnership with Pikangikum, Ontario. And we were able to raise $100,000 across our churches to see 10 homes in Pikangikum receive the gift of water, running water and toilets. And that was wonderful, wonderful work. I learned a lot in getting involved in this work. But one of the things that I learned is this. I learned that it's sometimes easier to help the people that we don't know, rather than to help the people that we do know. So it was way more straightforward and easy to raise $1,750 to put a well into a nameless community in Africa or South America. But there was no way of talking about water in our First Nations communities without also getting into the challenge and difficulty of recognizing that relationships have been broken. There was no way of doing that without also addressing all of the mistrust and misinformation and all of the history and politics that have led to this situation in the first place. Sometimes it's easier to help the people we don't know than the people we do know, and sometimes it's easier to name the truth as outsiders than as insiders. Now, this dynamic is abundantly clear in today's gospel story. There's a disturbing detail about this story that maybe caught your attention. There's an unfortunate herd of pigs that ends up going over the side of a cliff. And you might hear that part of the story and think, oh my gosh, like God doesn't care about these pigs? That's not what is signified by that detail of the story. We know that God cares about the pigs. We know that God cares about every sparrow, every blade of grass, every lily of the field. God creates and God says that it is good. But what the pigs tell us is that Jesus is on foreign territory. He has crossed the Sea of Galilee and he has gone way dramatically outside of his own people, outside of his own comfort zone. Because, of course, Jewish people don't eat pork and they don't farm pigs. And Jesus was in vulnerable, risky, foreign, even defiling territory. But Jesus, as the outsider in that situation, is able to have compassion on this man who is possessed by demons. He is a lost cause to his own people. We don't know the backstory, but we know that there must be a backstory of broken relationships that have led this man to be out screaming naked in a graveyard, totally and completely alone. And those broken relationships are further made clear to us when we see his people's reaction when he's healed. This incredible miracle takes place, but this man's village townspeople, they're not happy about it. They're upset about the pigs. And again, here what the pigs signify is they signify the wealth of that community, the livelihood of that community. They are more upset that they have lost their wealth and livelihood than they are glad and rejoicing that one of their brothers has been made well. That dynamic works the other way too. Because Jesus, amongst his own people, is not recognized. The religious authorities in Jesus' own community regard him with mistrust, with anger, with resentment. They're plotting against him. Who is it in this story who recognizes Jesus? Well, it's the ones that we might think are the very furthest away from God, the demons. And yet they recognize Jesus, Son of the Most High God. They recognize the power of God at work in his life. They recognize his intimacy with God. Sometimes it's easier to name the truth as an outsider than an insider. Sometimes it's easier to help the people we don't know than the people we do know. But the gospel doesn't let us just stay with what's easy. The gospel asks us to move beyond what is easy and to seek what is right. It would be a lot easier, we find out, it would be a lot easier for this man who is being healed to continue on with Jesus. Because Jesus had compassion for him. Jesus saw value in him when all of his people had abandoned him. And yet Jesus commissions him instead as an evangelist to go back to his community and to share the good news, because it's important that those relationships be healed, that this man and his people are able to see in him that he is a person of dignity and worth. Likewise, it would probably be easier for Jesus to stay on foreign ground through the rest of his ministry. In fact, he might have been able to avoid the cross if he had done that. But Jesus also is compelled to go back to his own people. He has to go back because there is all sorts of alienation, people alienated from the love of God. And he has work to do in offering an act of sacrificial love that will reach out across that chasm of alienation and offer people a way home. Now, in our lives, we're also asked to move beyond what is easy and to seek what is right. It is right and good that we should help others. And at the same time, we need to always be attentive to how it's possible that the person who needs our help the most is the one who's closest to us. And sometimes, in order to help them, we have to do that hard work of reconciliation and forgiveness, healing in our own relationships. As Canadians, it is right and good that we should be concerned about water in Africa, that we should be reaching out to welcome refugees, that we should be concerned about the needs of all of our brothers and sisters around the world. But we also are called upon to do that really hard work of reconciliation here at home. And that is going to involve difficult conversations, difficult questions. It's going to require a lot of patience and a lot of love as we move beyond mistrust and misinformation and stereotypes, as we seek answers as to why our Indigenous communities so often live in third world conditions, don't have access to those basic necessities of life, and why suicide rates are at a global high in so many of those communities. That is tough work. And along the way, as we follow the leading of the gospel, as we move beyond what is easy to what is right, there are moments of celebration along the way. Because of our partnership with Pikangikum, and because of the generosity of people like you and Anglicans all across Canada, we now have the money that we need to put clean water, running water, into 20 homes in Pikangikum this summer. That's going to directly change the lives of about 140 people. That's amazing. We also celebrate that today, Val Kerr, former priest of St. George's, is appointed Archdeacon of Truth and Reconciliation and Indigenous Ministries in our church. That our church is investing authority and visibility into her ministry so that she can be a leader in helping us in that hard and joy-filled and good and right work of truth and reconciliation. And Val always ended every sermon with these words: "For that I say, thanks be to God."